Masechet Kiddushin daf lamed zayin inu Mishnah kol mitzvah shi teluya ba'aretz ena hanoheget ela ba'aretz v'shena teluya ba'aretz noheget ben ba'aretz ben bechus ha'la'aretz. Any commandment that is dependent on the land of Israel, that only applies in the land of Israel. You only have to do that commandment if you're in Israel. Outside of Israel, you're not required to do that commandment. And any law that is not dependent on the land, then so that is practiced both in the land of Israel and anywhere that one lives. We'll have to define these terms. What does that mean for it to be dependent on the land or independent of the land? All right. Chutz min ha'orla v'chil'ayim. Two exceptions is orla. If you plant a new tree and you cannot use it for the first 3 years, that applies everywhere, even though it's something that is dependent on the land. And usually if it's dependent on the land, it applies only in the land. Orla applies everywhere. Also, kil'ayim, not mixing different seeds and growing them together in one patch, that also applies. So the land can have two different meanings. Aretz can mean Eretz Yisrael, or land meaning just earth, the ground. And so you could understand it as anything that's dependent on the fact that it grows in the ground only applies in the land of Israel. But if it does not dependent on growing in the ground, then it applies everywhere except for Olat Kilayim, which are agricultural laws, and yet they apply everywhere. This is true. Halacha l'maaseh. If you have a fruit tree and you live in New York, so you have to take care of it make sure not to use the fruit or even benefit from the fruit for the first 3 years. 4th year is a separate story. Kilayim also. Okay. That's Tanakama. Rabbi Eliezer Omer af he hadash. Rabbi Eliezer says also the laws of hadash, that any grain that grows during the year, you cannot consume it until after the second day of Pesach, when we start counting the Omer. This is also an agricultural law, and yet, according to the Rabbi Eliezer, it applies mideoraita in Israel and outside the land of Israel, although that's a minority opinion. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now we ask, what does this mean? Dependent on the land or not dependent on the land? So maybe any law that is introduced in the Torah with the words, with the verb bi'ah, like vayaki yebi'acha el ha'aretz, vayaki tavo el ha'aretz. Many laws are like that. When you come into the land of Israel, then you have to do this law, right? So then that means it's introduced with the land of Israel. That means it's dependent on being in the land, and therefore it applies only in the land. And if it's introduced without that formula, then that's not dependent on the land of Israel. So this is the first definition, but there's a problem. In the section that's in our tefillin, and that we say every day in the morning, here's the word bi'ah. When Hashem brings you to the land of Israel, to the land of Canaan, then you have to do the law of Peter Rechem, any firstborn animal, you have to give to the Kohen. If it's a Peter Hamor, then you have to give a seh instead. That applies everywhere. And also the paragraph ends with tefillin, and even though it's part of the paragraph of coming to the land, tefillin, right? Nobody says tefillin applies only in the land of Israel. It applies no matter where you live. So you see that just because it's introduced with bi'ah doesn't mean that is tiluya ba'aretz. Here is an exception to that rule. So we try a different definition. Amar Rav Yehuda hachi ka'amar kol mitzvah shi chovat haguf noheget ben ba'aretz ben bechus ha'la'aretz chovat karka ena noheget ela ba'aretz. Rather, Rav Yehuda explains that when we say the word mitulia ba'aretz here, that doesn't mean the land of Israel, it means the ground. So any mitzvah that is an obligation on the body of a person, right? Like tefillin, you have to put this on your body. Then that applies in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel. Whereas anything that's an agriculture-related law is dependent on the ground, the earth, anywhere you are, meaning just the definite, aretz meaning earth, not necessarily the land of Israel. Anything that's dependent on things that grow out of the ground, that applies only in the land of Israel. So really the word aretz has two meanings, two different meanings in the same sentence, right? Any mitzvah that is dependent on the ground, on the earth, right, applies only ba'aretz, meaning in the land of Israel, right? Whereas if it's not dependent on the ground, it's not an agricultural law, but it's a law about a mezuzah or anything else, of giving charity, Shabbat. We're going to talk about Shabbat in a second, right? These are all things that have nothing to do with things that grow from the ground, and therefore they're an obligation of the person, and they apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. Okay, that's Rav Yehuda as understanding of the Mishnah. Mina hanemile. Good, we accept that, and now we ask, what is the source from the Torah? Tetanu Rabbanan. Ele hachukim. We're going to analyze the following pisukim from Devarim. It says, Ele hachukim v'hamishpatim asher tishmerun la'asot. These are statutes and laws that you have to guard to make sure to fulfill them. Ba'aretz. That sounds like you have to do the commandments in the land. But then it says all the days that you live on Adama. So Adama, does that mean the same as Aretz? Aretz can mean it sounds like the land of Israel, because that says the land that I promised to your forefathers, right? So that's certainly the land of Israel. This Adama is going to take to mean all of the earth, no matter where you are. Incidentally, Ramban famously says that the laws of the Torah are obligatory mideoraita, right? Essentially in the land of Israel. He's talking about all of the laws. Why do we keep the mitzvot when we're in exile? To make sure to remember what they are, so that when we're redeemed and we come back, then we'll smoothly be able to keep them again. So Ramban takes this sugya and this derasha very seriously. Okay, but so we're going to analyze every phrase of this pasuk, and the next pasuk after that's going to come into play also is abed te'abedun et kol mekamot. Make sure to destroy idolatry. All right, so let's see. We're going to parse it phrase by phrase, atomize it. Ele chukim eloh midrashot. When it talks about chukim, these are things that we learn, mitzvot that we learn from a derasha, from an exegesis of a pasuk. And without the pasuk, we wouldn't be able to figure it out. So we learn it from a gezerah, shava, whatever. Hamishpatim elu hadunim. Mishpatim means civil laws, which are also reasonable, common sense. Maybe you could figure them out, right? So there's two categories of laws. Asher tishmerun zo mishnah, lasot zo ma'aseh. Tishmerun, this is things that we learn from Mishnah, meaning from categorical laws, codified laws. Lasot, these are things that we learn from precedent, right? Go see, what do people do? How do people act? How did someone judge a case in a similar situation? So these are two different sources of how, all different, 3 or 4 different sources of how we know things. Ba'aretz yachol kol mitzvot kulan lo yehu noagim ela ba'aretz. So it says, these are all the laws that you have to make sure to fulfill, and all these categories of laws in the land of Israel. So if I had just that word, I would think that all the mitzvot are applicable only in the land of Israel. So and then it says, all the days that you are on earth. Earth means anywhere you live, no matter what country, even outside the land of Israel. So now we have two different things. Now if I only had the phrase al adama, I would think that all commandments apply everywhere in the world. That's why it says adis, to say that some commandments apply only in the land of Israel. Now we have to figure out which one is which. Since the pasuk has an expansive phrase and a limiting phrase, that some apply everywhere and some apply only in some instances. If you want to know which is which, look at the context and the next pasuk. Abed tabedun et kol mekomot asher abedu sham. go destroy all places of idolatry. Idolatry, meaning keeping away from idolatry and destroying idolatry, that's a obligation on the person, right? It doesn't matter where you are. You have to destroy idolatry everywhere, and so that applies both in the land of Israel and the land and outside the land of Israel. So that's one example that we can use to generalize to other similar examples. So too, any law that's not dependent on things that grow out of the ground, but rather is an obligation of the person, applies everywhere. However, most laws that about things that grow apply only in the land of Israel. Good. Chutz min ha'orla v'kilayim, except for orla and kilayim, even though those are agricultural laws, those two apply everywhere. Now, that's the Tanakama. But then Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. Ibaya lehu. Rabbi Eliezer lekula palig or lechumra palig. When Rabbi Eliezer says his disagreement, there's two ways to read it. The simple way of reading it, which I did before, is lechumra, that you have orla and kilayim, even though they're agricultural laws, they apply everywhere. So that's a stringency. And Rabbi Eliezer comes and adding to the orla and kilayim, also, according to him, hadash. According to Tanakama, hadash is an agricultural law, a regular one, and applies only in Israel. Rabbi Eliezer says hadash applies also inside and outside the land of Israel. So that's lechumra. That's what we're going to argue first. But then we're going to show there's another way of reading it, that Rabbi Eliezer is actually going on the opening sentence. Any mitzvah that is dependent on the land only applies in the land, and that includes Hadash, against Tanakama, who says Ola Kilayim and all the more so Hadash apply everywhere. Rabbi Eliezer says Hadash is included in the first category, that's only in the land. A little bit more difficult to read it that way, but we're going to try and then figure out which is the correct reading. So here's the two ways of reading it. First, lechumra len lekula. Lechumra palig, v'achikamar tanakama. He is applying it more stringently and disagrees with the first with the Tanakama. The Tanakama said, "Chutz min ha'olam min ha'kilayim delchata gimiri la afagav de'ikal memar chovat karkahi." The Tanakama said he has a halacha that he knows from tradition that even though these two, orla and kilayim, are agricultural laws, and so therefore dependent on the ground, even though it would make sense, we would expect that they would apply only in the land of Israel. He learns a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that they apply everywhere. That's Tanakama. Aval hadash ba'aretz in bechus aretz la. But Tanakama says hadash, that is an agricultural law, so therefore, and there's no tradition of an exception regarding that one. Therefore, Hadash applies in the land and not outside the land. That's Urzol Tanakama. My ta'ama, Moshab, Lahad Yerusha V'Shiva Mashma. What's the source for Tanakama? Because it says the word Moshav. This is in fact regarding Hadash. Here is the Pasuk that we learn it from. Until this day that you bring the Korban HaOmer, you cannot eat from the new grain until you bring Korban Chukat Olam Ledorotechem Bechol Moshevotechem in all of your dwellings. Dwellings, what does that mean? Dwellings where? This means dwelling in the land of Israel after you inherit it. Moshe is speaking beforehand, he says when you go into the land and conquer it, inherit it, and you dwell there, right, securely, then this law will apply. So that's the word Moshav. All that is Tanakama. Af hadash noheg ben ba'ares ben bechosa la'ares. My ta'ama Moshav bechol makom she'atem yoshebim. Rabbi Eliezer says, listen, I agree that with the general rule that if it applies in the land of Israel, and it's only in the land, if it applies to the land, only in the land of Israel, and I would agree that Orla and Kilayim are exceptions, but I add also Hadash as yet another exception, and that applies everywhere. the source for that is because it says moshav. Moshav means dwelling. Anywhere that a Jew dwells, they are required to keep the law of Hadash. And so Moshav does not mean dwelling in the land of Israel. Then it would say Israel. Moshav means anywhere that you live. That's the first way of reading the Mishnah. Or we can read the Mishnah that Rabbi Eliezer is actually more lenient than Tanakama. V'achikama Tanakama. Chutz min ha'olav v'kelayim d'ilchat ha'gimiri v'chol sheken Hadash d'moshav kol makom she'atem yoshvim mashma. Tanakama thinks that all laws that are agricultural laws only apply in the land of Israel, except for land kilayim, even though they're agricultural laws, they apply everywhere, and that's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that they learned. And now, based on the Kal Vachomer, we say all the more so Hadash, because there it says the word Moshav as well, and Moshav means anywhere that you live. So there are, according to Tanakama, there are three exceptions. Even though Tanakama didn't mention Hadash, we're adding it in. Ola Kilayim are based on tradition. Hadash is based on an actual pasuk, and so therefore it's even more explicit. So he doesn't even have to say it. It's not learned from a Kal Vachomer, rather this from this word, the pasuk, but it doesn't say it because it's so obvious. But Tanakama thinks all three are stringent and they apply everywhere. Hadash eno noheg ela ba'aris demoshav lachad Yerusha v'yeshiva mashma umay af akamaita. Rabbi Eliezer comes and argues and says, listen, I'll agree with Orlan Kilayim, but I don't agree with Hadash. Those you have a tradition, good, I'll agree with that. But Hadash applies only in the land of Israel. It's an agricultural law. And furthermore, it says Moshav. Moshav, dwelling, doesn't mean anywhere you dwell. It means in the land of Israel, once you inherit it and then you dwell there, then it will apply. Now, when he says af, it sounds like he's agreeing and adding to what the Tanakama said, and he's saying, this also, in addition, adding. That sounds like it's a chumrah word, but we're explaining it now as going on the opening sentence. The opening sentence, laws that apply to the ground apply only in the land of Israel, and he's saying on that limited category that applies only in the land of Israel, also Hadash applies only in the land of Israel. That's the af, right? Also Hadash. Why would you think otherwise? Because Tanakama thinks otherwise. They think Moshav means everywhere, and Rabbi Eliezer thinks that Moshav means only in the land of Israel. So it's really dependent on two definitions of the word Moshav, and in this option, they're switched around the other way. All right, now we have these two options of reading the Mishnah. Let's try to prove the Chumrah way. Tashema Damar Abaye Man Tana de Palik Ale le de Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Ishmael hi detanya. So Abaye says, we know Rabbi Eliezer says Chadash, something about Chadash, and who is the Tanakama that argues with him? It is Rabbi Ishmael, who, and we learn his opinion in the following Beraita. Moshav eno ela lachar Yerusha v'yeshiva divrei Rabbi Ishmael. Anytime it says the word Moshav, that means in the land of Israel, after you inherit it. That's according to Rabbi Ishmael. So you see, Rabbi Ishmael thinks that the word Moshav means only in the land of Israel. Therefore, Rabbi Eliezer, who disagrees with him, thinks that word Moshav means everywhere. Well, it says Moshav b'chol moshavotechem regarding Hadash. So therefore, it must be Rabbi Eliezer thinks that Hadash applies everywhere, and that would be the Chumrah reading. Okay, so there you go. It's from Abaye. But we're going to quote the rest of the Braita, and we're going to analyze it further. Amar lo Rabbi Akiba, Hadesh Shabash nebar Moshavot v'noheget ben ba'aris ben b'chus alaris. Rabbi Akiba challenges Rabbi Ishmael because in the very same chapter, at the beginning of the chapter, this is in Parashat Emor that we read on the holidays, says Sheshet Yamim ta'avsem melacha b'yom shiv Shabbat Shabbatum melacha lo ta'asu Shabbati l'Adonai bechol moshevotechem. So it also says in your dwelling places regarding Shabbat, and yet Shabbat applies everywhere, according to everyone. So therefore, doesn't that mean that you're wrong? Moshav doesn't mean only in the land of Israel, right? Mochel moshevotechem means everywhere. Amar lo, Rabbi Ishmael counters, Shabbat kal vachomer at ya'ama misvot kalot nohagot ben ba'as b'mechus la'aretz Shabbat hamira lo kol sheken. And Rabbi Ishmael sticks to his opinion. It says Moshav itself means only in the land of Israel, and that's why, right, that Chadash and other things that say Moshav will only be in the land of Israel. But Shabbat, even though it says B'chol Moshevotechem, that we learn from a Kal Vachomer. If laws that are less stringent apply everywhere, so Shabbat, which is very stringent, certainly will apply both in and outside the land of Israel. So you learn that Shabbat applies everywhere from a Kal Vachomer, but the word Moshav itself really means only in the land of Israel. So to finish off the proof from Abaye, Midamar Abaye, Man Tana de Palig Ale de Rabbi Eliezer Bishmael, Shema Mina Rabbi Eliezer de Chumra Palig Shema Mina. Since Abaye said that the person that argues with Rabbi Eliezer is Rabbi Ishmael, and Rabbi Ishmael limited the word Moshav to only land of Israel, that means Rabbi Eliezer thinks that the word Moshav means everywhere, and that applies to Hadash, and therefore he thinks that Hadash applies everywhere, so it must be he's the Machmir one, and Tanakama says no, Chadash applies only in Israel, and so we conclude that this is the correct reading, that Rabbi Eliezer is stringent, adding Hadash, that it applies everywhere. So that is a conclusive proof. But now we go back to analyze the conversation in that baraita. Mikedi Rabbi Ishmael ahecha ka'eh anesachim. When Rabbi Ishmael said his first statement here, that whenever it says Moshav, that means only in the land of Israel. What context was he talking about? He was actually talking about nechasim, not just about Hadash. And here regarding nesech, this is wine libations that you add to other korbanot, and it says in this context, you see here it says both words, tabo, when you come to the land, and also it says dwellings, and then it continues on, isaron, balul, and talks about various wine libations. So that was the original context of Rabbi Ishmael. And B'nechasim bi'a'u moshav keti behu. There it says both words. Hachika amad. And here's what Rabbi Ishmael wants to teach. Lamed shekol makom shnemar bi'a'u moshav eno ela lachad yushav yeshiva tibrei Rabbi Ishmael. His point was when it says both words, coming to the land and dwelling in the land, then it means that law applies only in the land of Israel. But if it just said one of these words, right, then not so. Okay. Now, with this understanding, now this happens to be true for Hadash also. It says Bi'ah and Moshav. So that's right. That doesn't change. But it is going to change the continuation of the conversation. We can't understand the conversation of Ishmael who opposed Rabbi Ishmael, and he said, wait a second, regarding Shabbat, it says Moshav, and according to you, that means only land of Israel, but everyone agrees Shabbat applies everywhere. And then Rabbi Ishmael argued back and said, Shabbat is a Kal Vachomer because it's more stringent. Why did he say that? He could have said a much simpler thing, which is that Rabbi Ishmael was only talking about when it has both words, Bi'ah and Moshav, then we limit it only to the land of Israel. But if it only has one of the words, has Moshav, then that applies everywhere. And Shabbat, it only says Moshav. It doesn't say coming to the land of Israel regarding Shabbat. So he actually had a much better answer. Why does he have to go bring a Kal Vachomer? And so we re-explain, Hada ve'od ka'amar le. In fact, Rabbi Ishmael assumed that answer, and he's adding yet another answer. Hada da'ana bi'ah Moshav kamina. First of all, Rabbi Ishmael says, I think only when you have both words, then it applies in the land of Israel. But Moshav by itself would apply everywhere. And if you don't like that argument, I'll add another one. Ve'od ka'amat Hare Shabbat Shleman Moshavot, Shabbat Kal Vachomer Shabbat, regarding which it says Moshavot, it's a Kal Vachomer because it's such a stringent law. Certainly it's going to apply everywhere. Okay, good. So now we understand the conversation. Let's analyze the application, because this is interesting that the wine libations, he's saying, upon the Mizbeach, Rabbi Ishmael says apply only in land of Israel, and Rabbi Akiva says it applies outside the land of Israel. What would be the application? Can I go and make a wine libation? Rabbi Ishmael sabar lo kirbu nesachim bamidbar. Rabbi Akiva amar kirbu nesachim bamidbar. No, they're talking about whether libations were offered in the desert before they got into the land of Israel in the 40 years of wandering. Rabbi Ishmael said they did not do it in the desert because it says here both words, and therefore it applies only in the land of Israel beforehand, although they had a Mishkan and they were doing other things, but they did not do wine libations. Rabbi Akiva says they did wine libations in the desert. It does apply outside the land of Israel when, of course, in a context that korbanot were permitted outside the land of Israel. Because Rabbi Ishmael thinks that these words, even having both words, still applies to the outside the land of Israel. Amar Abaye, Hai Tana deber Rabbi Ishmael, Mapik meidach Tana deber Rabbi Ishmael. Now Abaye is going to say that this baraita that we had in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, who says that if it has both words, then it applies in the land of Israel. Otherwise, it applies everywhere. So that's actually more expansive. It's going to be more machmir. There's going to be more laws that apply everywhere. Is different from another transmitter that also transmitted something from the school of Rabbi Ishmael. The Tana, the Rabbi Ishmael. Ho'il v'nemnu bi'ot b'Torah, stam, ufarat achar katuv be'achad mehem, la'achad Yerusha v'Shiba, afkol la'achad Yerusha v'Shiba. The author of this baraita, in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, is different, and says that since it says many times in Torah, bi'ah, when you come to the land of Israel, and it says it without talking about dwelling, but in one case, it mentions both coming into the land of Israel and inheriting and dwelling in it. So therefore we can learn that any place that it says just coming to the land of Israel, that also applies only in the land of Israel. The case he's talking about is about the law of a king. It says, Ki tabo el haaretz asher na'alech noten lach, v'rishta v'yashavta ba. So here the law, when do you have to appoint a king? Only when you come into the land of Israel and you conquer it, inherit, and are dwelling there. I mean, it's not the first day the second you walk into the land of Israel, but rather only after it's well settled. Then the law of king applies. So too, this is a paradigm for all other laws, that even if it doesn't say Yerusha and Yeshiva, it also means that the law applies only in the land of Israel and only after you go and inherit it. Okay, good. So according to the first version of the Baraita, something applies in the land of Israel only if it says regarding that law both languages of bi'ah and settlement. So that's going to be fewer laws that apply only in the land of Israel. According to the Rabbi Ishmael, that any law that says come to the land of Israel, we assume that means it applies only in the land of Israel and only after you conquer it. So this is very different. Okay, so now we're going to ask V'idach. According to the first Baraita, what are they going to do with this law of the king? And why don't they use that as a paradigm for any law that says only bi'ah, that it's only when you settle the land of Israel? Mishum dehava melech ubikurim shene ketubim ke'achad v'chol shene ketubim ke'achad and melamedim. Because actually there's two laws that include this detail. The other one is Bikurim, Parashat Ki tabo, ve'ki tabo el haaretz, that's coming to the land of Israel. Noten lecha nachala v'rishta v'yashavta ba. So there it says also when you inherit the land and you dwell in it. Now, if we're going to use it as a paradigm, the Torah could have said it just once. From the fact that Torah goes out of its way to say, give two examples, that means we're limiting it to only those two examples. And if it says bi'ah alone, then not so. If he says bi'alon, that applies everywhere. Only if it says both of these, both terminology. If it says both kitabo and moshevotechem, right, as we saw above, that applies only in the land of Israel. If it says coming to the land of Israel and dwell there, vidishtem vidishta v'yashavta ba, that's only after you come in and conquer it and settle in it. Only those laws where it says both types of both languages explicitly, those apply only in the land of Israel at the time that you are dwelling there. But otherwise, it does not apply. Otherwise, it applies everywhere. If it says just come to the land of Israel, it applies everywhere. Good. So that's the author of the first braita. Now, back to the author of the second, ve'idach. Now, what is the second braita going to do with this fact that there are two examples? He'll say, sirichi. Yeah, but I need both examples. Therefore, they can act as a paradigm, because I wouldn't be able to learn it from just one. If the Torah only said the law regarding a king, that you have to appoint a king when you come into land and you inherit and dwell in it, and it didn't say anything regarding bikurim, I might have thought that, bikurim might apply in fact immediately, because immediately the first day that they went into the land of Israel, they're already going to go and they need something to eat, and so they're going to go and enjoy the produce of the land, and so they should bring bikurim right away. So I might have thought that bikurim would be an exception and does apply immediately in the land of Israel, and not only after you conquer it and dwell in it. So that's therefore the Torah needs to say regarding bikurim, the law of bikurim applies only after a while when you settle the land. And if that said only regarding bikurim, that applies after you dwell in it for a while, and didn't say the law regarding a king, I would have thought that I cannot use bikurim as a paradigm to the king, because the king needs to conquer immediately. You have to start right away, and in fact, even before you get into the land, you got to get a king so that you can have an army, so that you can go and conquer the land. You can't really conquer it before you have a king, and therefore the Torah has to specify regarding king that yes, even this law applies only once you're settled, and then if you want a king, you go appoint a king. You do not need to appoint a king beforehand. And so since we need both of them, it can act as a paradigm to any place that it says just come into the land. That also applies only in the land after you conquer it. Good, that's the second braita. Now back to the first braita. What are they going to do with that? Right? Don't you need both instances? ואידך נכתוב לך מן המלך ולא באי ביקורים ואנא אמינא ומה המלך תכבוש לאחר ירושה ושיבה ביקורים לא כל שכן. The other one will not agree with the logic over here that we said about bikurim, but rather the author of the first braita would say, no, the Torah could have just said it regarding king, and I would not need bikurim, and I could learn bikurim from the king. And I would say, if a king where that it would seem like obvious that you need a king immediately in order to conquer the land. And yet, even regarding a king, you don't have to appoint a king until you finish conquering it. You have to conquer it whatever, some other way. Like Yoshua, he's not a king, but he's a general in the war, and he leads conquering the land. And so if even regarding a king that I might think otherwise, still that applies only after a while, bikurim, all the more so, is only going to apply after you finish settling the land. So really, I could have had just the king to be a paradigm for all others. The fact that Torah says Yerusha says bikurim also means that those are two examples, and I cannot generalize from those two examples. Ve'idach, and the author of the second braita, if the Torah only wrote about a king, that applies when you enter into the land and dwell in it, and didn't write it regarding bikurim, and then I would have thought that bikurim would be similar to hala. Hala applies immediately when you come into the land of Israel, and that's something that grows from the ground. It's something that you give to the kohen before you can eat it. And bikurim is the same thing. It's also things that grow from the ground, produce, and you have to give something to the kohen from it. So I would have figured that since challah applies immediately, bikurim also applies immediately. And that would be an exception to the rule, and I couldn't learn that from the king. Therefore, the Torah has to go out of its way to say the law regarding the king and regarding bikurim, and therefore these are two necessary examples, and as two necessary examples, they can be generalized to all all other examples. And so now each of these baraitot can explain how they derive their views from Pisukim. Good. Now we're going to go through a series of items where it does say Moshe Botechem, and we even though it applies everywhere, and we wonder what does the word Moshe Botechem add? Now that we've established that everyone agrees that something that is a personal obligation, not an agricultural one, applies both in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel. So regarding Bechol Moshe Botechem, that says in Shabbat, in Vayikra 23, why bother saying that here, keep Shabbat in your dwelling if it applies everywhere? Why do you have to say in your dwelling, right? Even if we accept that dwelling means anywhere on earth, why do you need to mention it? In other words, Shabbat is a personal obligation. It doesn't have to do with things growing from the ground. It's you have to rest and not do work and all that. And so don't say Moshe Botechem, and I would know by myself that it applies everywhere. What's Moshe Botechem adding? And the answer is, since Shabbat is mentioned in that chapter, together with all the other holidays are dependent on the Bet Din in Yerushalayim to declare when Rosh Chodesh is, and then you know what day it is, right? We're about to celebrate Rosh Hashanah. How do you know when Rosh Hashanah is? Well, you need witnesses to come to the Bet Din. They say, oh, yes, today is in fact Rosh Chodesh, and then they set the Rosh Hashanah, Kippur, Sukkot. All the holidays are dependent whenever the Bet Din says so, and even if the witnesses come late, early, whatever, and the Bet Din accepts them and declares that today's the new moon, if it doesn't match up with the astronomical new moon, doesn't matter. It's only dependent on the Bet Din in Yerushalayim. So since Shabbat is mentioned in the same context, I might have thought that the same applies to Shabbat, that every Sunday, the Bet Din, the Sanhedrin, we get together and say, today is the first day of the week, and therefore in 7 days from now is going to be Shabbat, right? And they have to kind of calculate it and figure it out every week, and depends on their determination. So it's right. It's dependent on the Bet Hamikdash in the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim. I might have thought that. That's why it says Bechol Moshe Botechem. You have to keep Shabbat anywhere you are, and it's independent of Israel, independent of Yerushalayim. The Bet Din has no authority, no need, and no ability to decide when Shabbat is. Shabbat is continuous from the beginning of time, every 7 days, without taking a break ever. It's really a modern miracle that everybody in the world agrees when Shabbat is. Over the long course of history in all different countries and different places and times, right? There was no disagreement, miscalculation in some place that got spread. I think that this day is Shabbat. That's what the next day is Shabbat. We're not sure about the international dateline. So that's a big problem regarding Shabbat, but that's just in those places, do you put it here or put it there? But everybody agrees that Saturday, what everybody calls Saturday, is in fact Shabbat. So that's an amazing thing. Okay, that's why I need Moshe Botechem. It's independent of the Bet Din in Yerushalayim. Moshav de katab l'chamana gabe cheleb vedam lamali. Now also says the word Moshe Botechem regarding the prohibition of forbidden fats of animals and blood that one cannot consume. Why do I need Bechol Moshe Botechem? It applies I know it applies everywhere because it's Chovat Haguf, right? The animals don't grow from the ground. It's a person that is not allowed to eat them. Why do you have to tell me that it applies everywhere on earth? Because the prohibition against eating chelev and blood is mentioned in the context of korbanot. And so I might have thought that when the korbanot apply, meaning in Israel at the time that the Bet HaMikdash is up, then chelev and dam would be prohibited, because chelev and dam are parts of the animal that are sacrificed, sprinkled, thrown on the mizbeach. So I might think that that prohibition only applies in Israel during the Bet HaMikdash, but at a time when there is no Bet HaMikdash and no korbanot, and so anywhere when you're in exile and everywhere else, I might think that these laws do not apply. If there's no Bet HaMikdash and there's no korbanot, then you can eat chelev adam. That's why it says Bechol Moshe Botechem, in all times and all places. Moshav de katab l'chamana gabe masa umaror lamali. How come regarding the obligation to eat masa maror, it also says everywhere that you live? this is an obligation upon the person to eat them. So I would already know that it applies everywhere. Since the pasuk says you should eat the korban pesach, the meat of the Passover sacrifice, together with masot umerorim. So the original law is actually not to eat these separately, but to make one big lafa shawarma sandwich. And so you might have thought that when there's a korban, then it makes sense to make a sandwich with soft masa, and you wrap it up with maror, right, and delicious lettuce in your pita sandwich. So you might have thought that, not exactly pita, right, but masa, pita. So I might have thought that when you have a Korban Pesach, it makes sense to make a sandwich like that. But if there's no Korban Pesach, right, you're going to have a sandwich without any meat in it, right? That doesn't make sense. I mean, this is actually a good point, right? And it would be logical to not have a mitzvah of eating matzah and maror without Korban Pesach. Therefore, the word Bechol Moshevotechem comes to teach that these mitzvot apply anywhere. And this is a very important and brilliant derasha to make sure that we don't lose out on the whole ritual and meaning of the Pesach holiday just because we don't have a korban. Okay, it'd be nice to have a korban, so you don't have it. So now we shouldn't teach our children and think about Yetziat Mitzrayim and do these rituals to and understand their symbolism. No, of course, you still do it as best you can. So you don't have a korban. Make believe that you're eating a sandwich, which is exactly what we do. And so that applies everywhere you live. We already mentioned in Shemot 13, it says when you come into the land, you have to do tefillin, and you have to give the firstborn instead of a chamor, you have to give a sheep. Why do you have to say over there when you come to the land if it applies everywhere? Even though these are mitzvah taguf, nevertheless, it talks about it in terms of coming to the land as a cause and effect. If you do these mitzvot and are careful with them, then you will merit to be able to come to the land of Israel. It doesn't mean that when you come to the land of Israel, then you should do these mitzvot and only then. No, it means if you do these mitzvot, then you'll merit to do them in the land of Israel as well. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.